Hello again, and welcome to the second question and answers session. You can tell it's a Q&A session from the fact I've got a glass of cider again. Homemade cider, very good. I put up a challenge to people on Facebook and on Twitter a while ago to say, anybody who's got questions, do please hand them in, and then we'll see if we can answer them. And I was surprised to receive quite a lot of questions, so it's good news. Thanks a lot for all the people who got in contact. The first one came from Helen Gray on Facebook, which, what gives the most satisfaction in writing? Is it the initial ideas and the draft, or the end result? Interesting one. I think the most satisfaction for me comes from getting the ideas down on paper in a first draft. I really enjoy the process of dreaming up a new story and putting it down onto a computer or writing it down on paper, and it's for that reason that I can really rattle through a story very quickly when I start writing it. What I find really difficult is the nitty-picky stuff later on, of going back and checking word by word, sentence by sentence, exactly where all the grammatical or historical details are right, or where I've got to correct something. I find that really painful. Much more satisfying to sit at a desk and just imagine yourself in somebody else's shoes 700-800 years ago. So thanks a lot for that, Helen. And my daughter is now writing up on my whiteboard behind her, where do I find my inspiration? And this came from Robert Lair on Facebook, so thanks for that, Robert. Where do I get inspiration? I get inspiration from all over the place, and as you can see with the books that I've got around here now, I've got, for example, the gentry of Bedfordshire in the 13th and 14th centuries. I've got documents of local history, a selection of facsimile papers from the past. I've got little snippets of information in all of these books which I can use in future books. So I get inspiration from reading about the past, I get inspiration reading about the present day and listening to the radio, just getting ideas about how people are behaving. I also get inspiration from walking across the moors, just getting a blast of good sunshine, getting a feel for what it was like being in the past. You get that walking over Dartmoor. It's such an ancient location. You get a huge amount of feeling from it. And of course I get a lot of inspiration from beer and cider. Cheers. And Robert Lair's also asked, I assume this is Robert Lair because his name is still there, when I sit down and write, how long do I write for? And basically I keep on writing. A lot of people don't like having a word count, a daily word count, but I like having a word count. It's a way of assessing how far through the story you've got. It's a way of gauging how well you're working. So my normal routine is I'll walk the dog first thing in the morning, and then I'll start going through emails and Twitter and everything else while I'm walking the dog. It's a great thing about having a smartphone. When I get back, I'll normally be sitting down at 10:30 to 11 o'clock, and as soon as I sit down, basically I'm switched into work mode. So I'll start, the way I tend to work realistically is I work for 1 hour blocks. So I work for an hour and I'll type up about 1,000 words in an hour. After that I'll take a 10-minute break. I will get away from my desk, go out to the kitchen, make a cup of tea, make a cup of coffee, do something similar. I just have to get away from the desk. And then while I'm making the tea, doing whatever it may be, that's refreshing my mind, and I'm thinking about the next scene I'm going to write, because I tend to work scenes in 1,000 word chunks. So yeah, I'll work for an hour at a time. I tend to work for about 6 to 7 hours a day, so at the end of every day I will usually have written about 5,000 words. I do that 5 days a week, so I'll be sitting at my desk for 7 to 8 hours generally to get 5,000 words, because there's the other work I have to do. I have to answer other emails, I have to follow up obviously Facebook questions about how I do my working, and there's various other things I have to do. So yes, quite a lot of time. I tend to work, I'll work for about an hour and a half, 2 hours in the morning. I'll take a lunch break. I will then work in the afternoon for another 3 hours or so doing various things, and I'll work again in the evening. So I normally sit at my desk until about midnight most days. So next, Chalky White, hiya Chalky, good to find the ream is putting in questions as well. How do you keep concentration when there's so many distractions, Twitter, family, Facebook, etc.? That is a good question, Chalky. You understand these things, I know. Distractions such as a daughter with a bad cold walking behind the camera to get herself a new handkerchief. She's returned now, so I'll keep quiet. How do I maintain concentration? I find it's quite easy because when I'm sitting at my desk, I can put myself back into those scenes, back into that past, really very quickly. I don't know how I suppose it's the whole of my working life has been requiring me to put myself into other people's shoes. When I was a salesman, that was the most important strength I had, was that as a salesman you're having to imagine yourself in the mindset of the buyer so that you can put forward the best proposition to him. If you think that the buyer's trying to buy, for example, a computer because he thinks it'll make him look good and get him a promotion, then you highlight the aspects that would make him look really good from buying the computer. If you've got someone who's a financial director and his main thing is he just wants to save money, then you look at what sort of return on investment you get. In the same way, now that I'm a novelist, I spend all my time thinking, well, okay, if I was an archer slogging through the mud with the prospect of another battle up ahead, what would I be feeling? And it's just basically what I do. So yeah, I don't find it too much of a difficulty concentration. The worst problem is when school chucking out time comes and I get a 5-hour dissertation from my daughter on exactly what happened blow by blow with all of her friends at school. But it's nice to hear from her. And now she's written up the next question. Am I an intuitive planner or do I have to chart from start to finish? From Gel Cell. Hi Gel. Am I an intuitive planner? I think generally, because I'm writing about things that actually happened, I have a set time period that I'm looking at. So for example, I can start out knowing that I'm writing about the Cressy campaign. I know exactly how long that campaign was and I won't fiddle the facts and cheat or lie. So I have that. I can start writing not knowing where the story is going to go, and I can intuitively see how to improve the story or add to the story at every stage going through. Sometimes, the first few books, I did plan everything out to the nth degree. The very first book, Last Templar, I planned out on massive sheets of A3 and A2 paper on sitting on the floor. But the trouble with that was that I knew exactly where the story was going, and I think it became fairly obvious to anybody reading it as well. So about halfway through the book, I had to change my mind. It's a strange thing, but the nice thing about writing crime is you have a series of motivations and a series of potential suspects. You know that you've got to have 5 or 6 people who could have committed the murder. Each one of them has to have motive and means and opportunity, because otherwise, if only one person has all 3 aspects, it's fairly easy to tell who's committed the crime. The nice thing about writing crime is that you can actually write an entire book, provided you set out those characters and their motivations properly. Any one of them could be the criminal. So at the end of the book you may only have to go back to chapter 5 and put in one line of text or one little piece of dialogue, and that will change the whole direction of the end of the book. A number of times you get people who write and say, I didn't see that one coming, but when I went back and reread the book I saw where you'd put that line in. That's part of the job of being a novelist. So next question from Laurie Lee Steiner. Hi Laurie. What contributions does your dog give you? Inspirations, smiles, etc. during my writing day? She gives me lots of smiles, several frowns, especially when she breaks wind in the background. Horrible hound, you might hear her snoring even now. But the main thing she gives me is she forces me to take time off and go out for walks. And that does give me a lot of inspiration, as I mentioned earlier. It's a wonderful thing to have a dog around, purely because it forces you to get up from the desk and spend an hour or 2 taking some exercise. That in its own right makes it worthwhile having a dog. Even better if you've got 2 dogs, or 3, or 4. I aspire to such things. Next question. How do I get into the role of a woman? By Terence Sadowski, I think that is. My daughter's writing is not perfect, but then my pronunciation is probably a lot worse. Hi, Taryn. How do I get into the role of woman? Difficult to get into the mindset of someone else. However, I find this quite an interesting thing, because you often find people say, well, you wrote that really well, but you're a bloke, how can you write a woman? And the same way, I think a lot of women don't get the same remark. I think female authors are very rarely asked how they get into the mindset of a male protagonist, which I think is a slightly odd thing. I think that males or females, you can easily imagine yourself in the mindset of the other sex. It doesn't really have any problem, because that is our entire job. That's what we do. We imagine ourselves as other people. If you've known lots of women, I have. I've been married for a while. It makes it a lot easier. You understand how the minds work. How do I decide the amount of historical content that should go in a story? This is Tom Belkowski. Hiya, Tom. Hope Florida's looking good today. How do I imagine the amount of historical content? Well, all of my books tend to be historicals, so a lot of my work is making sure that the history is right, and I put a lot of effort into that. I actually had an email today with someone asking, should I have used the term cloth yard for an arrow, because he thought that cloth yard was an 18th century term. Well, my Bible, the Oxford English Dictionary, is open here. Cloth yard was used from the 1400s onwards. If it was written down in the 1400s, you can bet certain parts of your anatomy that it was almost certainly in use for quite a while before that. Cloth yard is literally the width of a yard of cloth. It was a standard measuring term that was used throughout the medieval period, I think. So it may not have been written about too much, but it was almost certainly in use. So historical detail, it's just the thing that I live with. All of my research is spent making sure that the history is correct. So cheers, Tom. And then when I plot out a mystery, do I start from the commission of the crime, or have I divided motive? Have I divided motive and motive? That is, my daughter's writing is as good as her mother's. Motive and murderer. When I start from the commission of the crime, or have I divided motive? It's different with every book, I think, is the fair way of putting it. Sometimes I will start out, I've very often started writing the book, the murder, because I like having a murder on page one. It's a very simple approach, but it means that no one can argue with the fact you're writing a crime book if you start with the murder on page one. I like that idea. Never in any of my books, I think, have I managed to stick with that, though. It's good cider, cheers. But I tend to find that I'm much more interested in the thoughts and the motives of all the people involved. So I will start with Ham was found lying on the floor in the courtyard with his head smashed open and blood all over the place. But then I'll think, yeah, but what was he doing before that? How did he get there? So then I'll write a couple of pages about, and what he was doing on the way there, and then I'll write a bit, well, if you're going to have him there, then what happened to his mate that he was talking to? So then I'll have another section on where his mate went before Ham died. And by doing that, I started off with one book, I remember, where I started with the murder on the first page, and then when I went through it all, I discovered that the murder actually ended up on page 120, and I had to do a lot of extensive editing to bring the murder forward a bit and then fill in the backstory a bit later. It does get very problematic, but I tend to know who the poor murder victim's going to be, and I know quite a lot about him before I start the book, but I don't necessarily know all the motives for killing him. Leslie Judd on Facebook asked, have you always written, or was it something you had to work at? Oh boy, did I ever have to work at it. I was a computer salesman for 13 years. I had 13 jobs in 13 years. Now 3 of those jobs lasted more than a year. 2 of them lasted more than well, they were over 4 years each. So for about 10 years I had 3 jobs, and the rest of the jobs I fitted in over the next 3 years. I didn't have time to write in those days. I was writing lengthy tenders for £1 million plus computer deals. And so I was writing 200 page documents, but that wasn't quite the same as making it all up, honest. But I I started writing in about 1990, and I was writing 1 or 2 chapters at a time when I did get time off when I was on holiday. But I never got further than about 1 or 2 chapters, and that's part of the reason why, when I decided that after my last job, my 13th job, I decided I would try writing, because I couldn't think of any other careers that were really open to me as a completely untrained person. So when I started writing, I started writing because I couldn't see any other career that was open to me, because I was completely unqualified. After 13 jobs in 13 years, that wasn't really surprising. I had written the beginnings of several books, but only the first 2 or 3 chapters, and people who looked at them said they wanted to know what was going to happen, and they were quite irritable when I didn't write any more about those books, but they were just getting ideas down on paper, which is how I'd recommend anybody who wants to write really starts. Find yourself some peace and quiet and start writing. Don't worry about whether it's going to go anywhere, just write something. But when I decided I was going to see if I could write a book, which was the 1st of January 1994, 20 years ago, I sat down and decided I was going to write a book. I picked on the genre I felt happy with, which was crime thriller, and I wrote a modern day spy thriller involving crime in 1 month. The next book I wrote was a management book on how to get yourself employed if you find yourself out of work. Did that in the month of February, and then the 3rd month was March. I wrote The Last Templar, which sounds quite blasé. I was working from 6:30 in the morning through till about midnight, 7 days a week. So I was working very hard, but I had to prove to myself that I could actually finish books. And Leslie also asked, how do you know you're on the right track with a storyline? That's an interesting one, because you never do. You really never know whether you've got the thing to work properly until it goes in front of an editor and they give you their opinion. However, there are some things you can do. One thing I do, for example, is what I used to do was I'd take a sheet of paper, tear it into 4 pieces, so fold it in half again, just rip it into 4 pieces, and I would write every scene onto a strip of A4, and then each of those I would have stuck on blue tack onto my bookshelves, so I could see the full flow of a storyline by looking down these strips of A4, or I'd have them on the walls and all over the place. And the great thing about that was you could see how far it was from one scene to another, where there was action or some form of dispute or some sort of argument or some challenge or anything else. I'd have action scenes written in red ink. I'd have scenes which involved passionate difficulties, arguments and everything else in green. I'd have other scenes written in, but you could see where all of those scenes were going down, and that's one of the most important things about any novel, is that there's enough action and excitement to draw the reader in and keep the reader going. Nowadays I've got the same thing set up, but it's on the software package I use, Scrivener. And oh, I've got another question here. No, I haven't. I've got, people have asked what made me write about this period of history. This is true, yes. I'm told that will be answered on its own in a separate video coming up soon. My daughter can't spell separate, but never mind that. She's looking shocked now. She's correcting the wrong part. But never mind that. Yes, I'll be talking about why I chose this period of history. The main question on that is actually regarding the 100 Years' War. Why did I go to the 100 Years' War after my Baldwin and Puttock series? Well, that will be answered in detail before too long. And I think that's all of the Facebook and Twitter questions used. So, thank you for watching and listening. If you enjoy this, do please go and give a thumbs up or a like to this as a video. Please add any comments that you've got, any questions or any additional comments, as long as they're not too rude. My daughter might read them. If you could subscribe, I'd be very grateful. It saves me having to send out so many Twitter messages, and it makes things look really nice when we see additional subscribers coming. Favourite it, share it, and my daughter's given me a last instruction, which I will give in a second. First of all, I've got to say, homebrew cider, very good idea. I can thoroughly recommend it. And now the very last word she's written up is bye. Cheers. Today I'm talking about belladonna at Belston, and there's a good reason for coming up here. The reason is